Yeah.
If you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who likes to, really get into the weeds on a topic. You don't want the surface level stuff. And that's exactly why we're here today. We're going deep on something that's, well, it's almost impossible to avoid talking about in America, guns. We're not here to tell you what to think.
Sure.
Not at all. It's more like we're going to lay out the major arguments, the different perspectives on gun rights, the risks, the regulations, the whole thing, so you can walk away feeling like you've really explored the core of this debate.
Yeah, and it is a debate, right? I mean, it gets heated sometimes for sure. And to really get a sense of that, we dug up this discussion. It's called Guns in America, Rights, Risks, and Regulations.
Okay.
And it's this conversation between two people, Mark Reynolds, who's all about gun rights, and Linda Parker, who's more on the side of stricter gun control. So we're going to kind of break down what they talked about, see where they agree, where they disagree, the whole 9 yards.
Perfect. All right, so let's start right at the heart of it, the Second Amendment. In this discussion we found, Mark Reynolds, the gun rights guy, he comes out strong, quoting the amendment directly. He says, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed." And for him, this is not just about, like, owning a gun. It's tied up with personal freedom, like the ultimate freedom to protect yourself, even from the government, if it comes to that. He sees it as, like, a fundamental part of being American, woven into our history and identity.
But then you have Linda Parker, and she comes right back at him with a different perspective. Like, she acknowledges the Second Amendment, but she's really emphasizing how much society has changed since then, right? She talks about this epidemic of gun violence, and she points to mass shootings and just the rising number of gun deaths in general. For her, it's all about public safety. That has to be the priority. So she's pushing for things like stronger background checks and limits on, those high-capacity weapons, or the ones that can fire a lot of rounds really quickly. And she brings up a point that comes up a lot in this debate. She says countries with stricter gun laws, they just have way fewer deaths from guns. So, that raises the question, is it okay to maybe limit some people's freedom a bit if it means saving lives overall? It's a tough question, right? A real balancing act.
For sure. So we see this clash right away. Individual freedom versus keeping everyone safe. It's a classic dilemma.
Look.
But, okay, so then the discussion, it moves into this territory of compromise. They start talking about background checks and what are called red flag laws.
Right.
Mark Reynolds, even though he's a strong Second Amendment guy, he says he's open to having a reasonable conversation, but he's worried about, like, punishing the responsible gun owners, the ones who aren't causing any trouble. He doesn't think that's going to stop the criminals. He thinks we should be focusing on, like, cracking down on illegal guns and dealing with the mental health crisis. He says, enforce the laws we already have, make it easier to get mental health help, that kind of thing.
And that's a really important point. But, Linda Parker has a response to that. She says making the laws stricter, it does make it harder for everyone to get guns, including criminals. That's just the reality. And she brings up universal background checks. So checking everyone who wants to buy a gun, no matter where they buy it from. And she also talks about waiting periods, making people wait a certain amount of time between when they decide to buy a gun and when they can actually take it home. She says there's evidence that these things can actually reduce gun violence. And, she even uses Australia as an example. They had horrible mass shooting in Port Arthur a while back. And afterward, they changed their gun laws, like really restricted certain types of guns. And you know what? Their gun deaths went way down. So it's an interesting example, right? It shows how changing laws can actually make a difference, at least in that particular situation.
It's a compelling point.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, okay, well, if it worked there, could it work here? And speaking of different approaches, the discussion in our source, it goes on to explore this idea that, sometimes a good guy with a gun can actually prevent violence, stop a bad situation from getting worse. Mark Reynolds, he's a big believer in this. He talks about cases where he thinks armed citizens have actually stopped active shooters. And he asks a pretty powerful question. He says, imagine you're in a life or death situation. Wouldn't you want to be able to defend yourself? And, it's hard to argue with that on a gut level, right?
Yeah, it really makes you think. But Linda Parker, she counters this with, cold, hard data. She says, look, when you look at the numbers, more guns often equal more gun deaths. And it's not just homicide. She's talking accidents, domestic violence, suicides, all of it. She points out that the U.S. has a ton of guns compared to other developed countries, like way more guns per person, and sadly, we also have way more gun deaths. So her point is, having more guns around, it might not be the solution to violence. In fact, it could be making things worse. And it's fascinating to see how these two sides, they're looking at the same reality, but they're coming to completely opposite conclusions about what keeps people safe.
It's a mind-boggling situation. Okay, so as this discussion wraps up, both sides get a chance to give their final thoughts. Mark Reynolds, he sticks to his guns, so to speak. He says the Second Amendment is non-negotiable. He's still all about enforcing existing laws, improving mental health care, and making sure good people can defend themselves. He's not interested in limiting gun rights at all.
And on the other side, Linda Parker ends with this really powerful statement. She says, gun rights should never outweigh the right to live safely. It's a pretty clear stance, right? She's definitely in favor of what she calls common sense reforms to protect people from gun violence.
So what we've really uncovered here is this fundamental tension. The right to own guns, which is protected by the Constitution, and the need to keep everyone safe. Two really important ideas, but they often seem to be pulling in opposite directions.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the question we want to leave you with. Thinking about everything we've talked about today, the different arguments, the statistics, the personal stories, what really stuck with you? What made you think, that's a good point, or wow, I never thought of it that way? And what new questions do you have about this whole issue of guns in America? It's a complex problem, and there are no easy answers, but we hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of the core issues at play. It's something we all need to grapple with, and the more informed we are, the better.
Couldn't have said it better myself.